Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Community Conversation Series, this one called Desegregation of Falls Church Libraries and the Question of Access. As Jenny said, my name is Devanshi Patel. I am the CEO for Center for Youth and Family Advocacy, also known as CYFA. And on behalf of CYFA and the Mary Riley Stiles Public Library, we're so excited to have you join us here today for an informative and interactive discussion on library desegregation and continuing questions of access. CYFA is particularly excited to host this event because we focus on creating community conditions necessary for kids to thrive. And of course, critical to those community conditions is the ability for community members to be able to engage in healthy, open, and honest discussions on challenging issues like the ones that we're going to be talking about today, our collective history and where we go from here. We're excited to engage with you on this discussion, and I'm also excited to welcome our very distinguished panel for the discussion. I'm going to quickly go through our panel, and then, as Jenny said, I'm going to turn it over to her, and she's going to lead us off. Jennifer Carroll has served as the director of the library since 2017. She's also a member of the city's social equity action team. She is the architect for today's community conversation, and we thank her for her passion guiding this conversation to you here today. She's going to start us off with a land acknowledgement, and then she's going to help us understand the role of libraries, including what the role of the library is in the community. Chris Barbuschak is going to talk to us about his book. He's the head of the Virginia Room at the Fairfax County Public Library. He co-authored a recent book called Desegregation in Northern Virginia Libraries. He's going to help us understand the history of desegregation of libraries in Northern Virginia and the landscape of Falls Church within that history. He also has books here, which what I overheard was these might be the last 13 we have. So. Paula Hawkins is a staff member at the library's circulation desk. You may have seen her. She researches the history of the library, and she provided research support to the book. She's going to help contextualize today's conversation on library desegregation to the city of Falls Church and what she literally and figuratively learned from her research. There's also materials here that she's going to orient us to. Reverend Page will be joining us. He's the senior pastor at Galloway United Methodist Church. He served as the co-chairperson of the Virginia UMC Conference Board on Church and Society. Reverend Page will share with us information regarding the legacy of library segregation and what library desegregation meant for people of color, particularly Black Americans in Northern Virginia. And, of course, Edwin Henderson II is the founder of the Tidner Hill Heritage Foundation, the vice chair of the city's Historical Commission, and a former Falls Church City School Board member. He's going to contextualize the history of library segregation to the experience of the city's residents, particularly people of color. Just by way of format for what you can expect today, each of our speakers will speak for about 5 to 6 minutes. And at the conclusion of the discussion, we're going to open the conversation up to questions. And then, of course, at the end of that, what we're going to do is move into some smaller discussions, which will be facilitated by Gregory Baldwin and Molly Newton, sitting in the back. Greg is the Director of Restorative Practices for CYFA, and he leads its Promoting Empathy Through Equitable Resolution and Relax, Relate, Restore programs. Greg also serves as the Director of Restorative Practices for the Alexandria City Public School System. And Molly is the co-founder and CYFA's Chief Operations Officer. She's also an attorney specializing in juvenile, child welfare, and criminal defense work. So thank you all again. That was a lot that I've just said by way of introduction. Thank you for joining us. We know that this is just the beginning of some conversations that the library would like to hold in the community. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to start our discussion.
So this is the first time that we've done this particular acknowledgement, which will be a land and labor acknowledgement. So it is, both of these are ongoing and living acknowledgements as we seek to understand the history of the city of Falls Church and the impact on displaced and enslaved peoples. As we learn from our past, we hope to improve the future and continue to engage with the community, encouraging dialogue and learning across cultures. So, we acknowledge that the land that the library resides on and where we work, learn, and gather as a community was originally inhabited by the Piscataway tribal nation. We acknowledge that this land also was where enslaved people worked and lived as part of the Trammell Tract, which is modern-day City of Falls Church. We must recognize and acknowledge that the United States, as we know it, was built at the expense of enslaved Black people and indigenous populations, and that they suffered the horrors and dehumanization of slavery, segregation, and Jim Crow laws. We remember those who came before us and recognize the truthful history of our community. With gratitude, we acknowledge the work of early activists, E.B. Henderson, Reverend W.E. Costner, who moved to the library and I would say challenged the library to put into practice the espoused values. And we seek to promote understanding and recognition of that history. So, do you want me to go into my introductory comments? Recently we did sort of a revamp of our mission, vision, and value statement. And we updated that with the community as participants in the process. So a main focus of the stated mission, vision, and values is the community. Public libraries have long been centerpieces of communities, and the City of Falls Church is no different. So people come to Mary Riley Stiles Public Library to connect, find resources, discover new ideas, and build relationships. However, we would like to believe that public libraries have always been open to all and neutral. Libraries haven't always lived up to the values that they have espoused. And certainly we see that in our own history and the history of libraries in Northern Virginia, which other speakers on the panel will provide context. And there have been barriers to library use, from explicitly banning Black people to covertly erecting barriers to use, such as requiring a physical address in order to receive a library card. The recent community survey that was done, while it was very positive as a whole for the city and for the library in particular, it highlighted populations where we still need to reach out to and break down barriers to library use. The areas that stood out for me were members of the community with lower educational levels, lower incomes, and those demographic groups that are other than white, especially Black members of the community. So, as a beginning, and to continue the work that we've been doing, today we hope to continue that dialogue and evaluation of the barriers to public library service by examining our past and making connections to the present. The public library is a living service, always changing for the better for our community. So who am I going to next? Chris?
Okay. All right. I got a quick PowerPoint. Is it okay to load it up real quick? Or do you want me to just?
I think so.
Yeah? All right.
Yeah.
All right. My name is Chris. How did I end up on this esteemed panel? Well, I don't know. In April 2021, Dr. Sujatha Hampton, who is the education chair of the Fairfax County NAACP, was appointed to the Fairfax County Public Library Board of Trustees. She wanted to know if Fairfax County Public Libraries were ever segregated, and if they weren't segregated, how was it possible that the school systems were segregated and the libraries weren't? So I work in Fairfax County Public Library's Virginia room, and that question was directed to us. My coworker, Suzanne LaPierre, received this email question, and the library board asked us to kind of dig deep and see what was going on in Fairfax County and the surrounding Northern Virginia public libraries. We presented our research, and we were told to write a book, and that's how I ended up here. So a real crash course on what was going on in Northern Virginia public libraries during the era of Jim Crow. Northern Virginia was uniquely situated between classic Deep South and the relatively progressive city of Washington, D.C. Practically all the libraries in Virginia either did not provide service to Black residents and just served white citizens, or they just had segregated bookmobile service. D.C. had the D.C. Public Library, which was open to everyone from the beginning, as well as the Library of Congress. In 1946, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law in the Virginia Code that required any public library that received state aid was required to make available its library services to everyone. But Northern Virginia library systems interpreted the language "make available" as giving segregated bookmobile service or having segregated library buildings or branches, and they got away with it. In other cases, like in Loudoun County, libraries just completely ignored the rule and only served white residents. So you could see here, there is a table of when the libraries desegregated in Northern Virginia, and you could see this accounts for the discrepancies. So the man who started it all was Samuel Tucker. He was a young attorney, lived here in Alexandria, and he staged the first civil rights sit-in in Alexandria in the hopes of desegregating Alexandria Public Library. That's Samuel Tucker there on the left. In 1937, the city of Alexandria built the Kate Waller Barrett branch. Still exists today. It's on Queen Street. It's part of the Alexandria Public Library system. And it was only open to the city's white residents. Tucker lived only 2 blocks away from the new library, but was denied use of it because of his race. So we got 5 young guys, ages of 18 to 22, to help him desegregate the library by staging a sit-in. They both dressed very nicely, were very well-mannered, politely entered the library individually. They asked for a library card application, were promptly refused. They pulled a book off the shelf and calmly sat down and started reading it. When they refused to leave, they were arrested, and Tucker had the press there, and they took that photograph there in the hopes that this case would make nationwide news and bring awareness of the injustice that black citizens couldn't access libraries. Instead of integrating the library, though, the city of Alexandria instead hastily built a separate library branch up there on the right, the Robert Robertson Library in 1940. It was smaller, it had older book collection, it had limited hours, and Tucker refused to use it. It was another 20 years after this stage sit-in that the library system actually desegregated in phases from 1959 to 1962. Next door in Arlington County Public Library was established in 1936 when 5 existing community libraries that were segregated formed the library system. They only served white residents. 4 years later, in 1940, black residents mobilized to form the Henry Louis Holmes Library Association, which you see there in the top right. It was that small little building there. It became assimilated as a black branch for the Arlington Public Library system in 1944, and it successfully operated until it closed in 1950 because the federal government seized the property by eminent domain to build some apartment complexes, and they had to close the library. Instead of actually building another segregated library branch, Arlington Public Library decided to quietly integrate, and they became the first library system in Northern Virginia to integrate its library system. And for those of you who don't know, Arlington County also was the first county in the state of Virginia to desegregate its school system in 1959. Next door is Fairfax County. That's where I'm from. In 1939, Fairfax County Public Library was established, and they built that little garage of a building there, which housed the bookmobile. They partnered with existing community libraries, including Herndon and Vienna, and right here, Mary Riley Stiles Library, which is known as Falls Church Public Library, and they agreed to serve the white residents of Fairfax County. Mary Riley Stiles Library, then known as Falls Church, only served white residents. However, Fairfax County did agree to serve the black residents of the county, and they opened 2 segregated bookmobile deposit stations, one in Falls Church and one in Fairfax County. We don't know where those locations are, we just know they existed. So if you were black living in Fairfax County or Falls Church in the 1940s, the only way you could get library books was through those 2 deposit stations. You couldn't even go on the library bookmobile that would visit the different stops in the county. If you were white, on the other hand, you could access library books at 46 different deposit stations. You can actually go on the bookmobile. You could get it at the white schools. You could get it at the community libraries. Fairfax desegregated quietly in 1954 when the library building there renovated and opened up, and a branch opened up for the first time. And that is a picture of Dora Lee Johnson. She is the first black employee that was hired at FCPL around 1957. Loudoun County has a really interesting story. Has anybody heard of Samuel and Josie Cook Murray at all? Has anybody heard of this? Have you guys heard of this? No? Okay. So Loudoun County Public Library wasn't established until 1973, but the pre-existing Percival Library, which was established in 1937, is the oldest branch of the system. It was segregated from the very beginning, and it even refused to provide bookmobile service to the black residents of the county, despite protests from both white and black community members. That all changed thanks to Sam Murray and Josie Cook Murray. They were a married couple. They lived in Purcellville, and they owned a very successful upholstery shop. In 1956, President Eisenhower's sister-in-law, Mike Murray, who lived nearby, commissioned them both to design some Austrian-style draperies for their windows. They had never designed such a design before, so they went to the Purcellville Library to check out some books to research about it, and they were promptly refused service there. Mr. Murray, who was 42 years old at the time, said, quote, "If I didn't pay my taxes, they would sell my home. Since I do pay my taxes, I felt I should have use of the book from the library, which is paid for by my taxes," end quote. So the case should have been open and shut, because as early as 1946, Virginia law did require the library, because it was publicly funded, to serve everybody. They didn't. Nevertheless, many attorneys passed on it because they wanted to sue the library to get access, except for one attorney named Oliver Stone of Alexandria. They sued the library system, and Stone reminded the library board of their legal obligation to provide service to everyone because of state funding. And the library board, afraid of losing state funding, agreed to integrate in March 1957. But the segregationists were not going to go quietly without a fight. They vowed to close the library to everyone. Instead of integrating, they were just going to permanently close it. Or they also decided, well, maybe we can make it a private library instead of a public library instead of integrating. After much drama at a Loudoun County Board of Supervisors meeting, including 2 tie-breaking votes, the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors voted to fund the library, which meant they were going to integrate in April 1957. So it was the first victory of the civil rights movement in Loudoun County. Wrapping up here, Prince William County was the only library system in Northern Virginia that when it was founded, it was open to everyone from the beginning. So it was established in 1952. It was a demonstration public library. That's the bookmobile, and that's an amazing photograph that the Prince William County Library has of citizens using the bookmobile. So I'm going to pass it off to Paula here. Paula's going to talk about Falls Church. A little bit background about Falls Church Public Library. It was established in 1899 by the Village Civic Improvement Association. And it was in the backyard in a garage-looking building behind the mayor of Falls Church. It became somewhat of a nomad, moving around different locations of Falls Church for years until it was given a permanent home here in 1958.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So I first came to this question of this issue of library desegregation when I was working on my library degree a few years ago and reading about the fact that public libraries in these United States were not, in fact, always open to everyone, that they were reserved in many places for whites only during the Jim Crow era. When I did my internship here at the Mary Riley Stiles Public Library, I started wondering, what had the policies and practices been here? During my internship here with the library, I had the opportunity to delve into the resources, the library archives, the library records in the Falls Church History Room with the help of Olga and Beth and other colleagues here, to try and uncover what those practices had been. I did not find any outright statement that this library refused to serve blacks. I found nothing indicating there were separate entrances or separate spaces in the library. But it became clear, looking through the records, that in fact, black patrons had not been served. So then, we wanted to look at the context of the community and especially education to try and understand how this lack of access had been permitted and how change ultimately was brought about. So in terms of the community, as Chris pointed out, Falls Church has this really interesting liminal position, right? It's right on the fault line of South and North. Virginia was a massive slaveholding state before the Civil War, But this community had a real influx of Northerners in the 1800s. So when time came to vote on secession leading up to the Civil War, Falls Church did vote to secede, but it was by a much narrower margin than in surrounding communities. Black families settled here, and we had a black town council member, Frederick Foote, served on the Falls Church Council from 1880 to 1889. But this hopeful period of Reconstruction came to, an abrupt end, symbolized here in Falls Church with the retrocession of a big chunk of Falls Church territory. It was retroceded back to Fairfax County, and it was South Falls Church, the Tinner Hill area, where it was mostly black families living there. So the black population, the percentage of black population in Falls Church plummeted and really has not ever fully recovered. Then in 1914 and 1915, there were racially based zoning ordinance proposals made, including one by Samuel Stiles, the husband of our Mary Riley Stiles, who was, a primary figure in running this library for many years. This ordinance did pass, but it was not enacted thanks to the efforts of black activists, Joseph Tinner and Dr. E.B. Henderson, who banded together, formed the Colored Citizens Protective League, and successfully fought it in court. But this remained a profoundly segregated community. One of the oral history tapes I listened to in the history room talked about a gentleman who lived here in the 40s and 50s said, you knew what doors not to go into. It was just implicit. It was understood. White public facilities, the State Theater that was built in 1936, public transportation, these were for whites only, and including educational institutions. Schools were segregated here until well after the Brown v. Board of Education rulings. Before the Civil War, learning was reserved for whites only. It was illegal for blacks to learn to read. It was illegal for people to teach blacks to read. The United States had the unhappy distinction of being the only place to enact anti-literacy laws. This was symbolized here in Falls Church, the example of John Reed, who was a Northern abolitionist, came to Falls Church and established a school to teach blacks to read during the Civil War. He was captured. He was executed by Mosby's Rangers. There's a plaque about this, I think, up by Panera on Broad Street, and John Reed's grave is in the graveyard of the Falls Church. The public school system was segregated. In 1887, the black community built a 2-room wooden structure for a school for their black students on land donated by James Lee. In 1882, by contrast, the white community had established a 2-story brick building for its white students. And that was done with the support of Joseph Riley, who was the father of Mary Riley Stiles. There was no high school opportunity in Falls Church for black students. Any black student who wanted a high school education had to find a way to get into the district and enroll in a school there, or go out to the trade school in Manassas. All this was allowed by the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal ruling by the Supreme Court. But activists, railed against this. Mary Ellen Henderson, who was the wife of Dr. E.B. Henderson and the principal of the James Lee School, worked energetically to point out the disparity in resources for the 2 school systems. And we have over in the displays a copy of a 1-page report she authored, entitled Our Disgrace and Shame, that points out the shocking disparity in resources for the 2 groups. And I thank Mr. Henderson, whose Tinner Hill website has that document. It's really shocking. It's worth spending some time studying. So the Falls Church schools, the City of Falls Church schools, remained segregated until 1961, when 3 black students were able to enroll. Marion Costner, who was the great-granddaughter of Joseph Tinner of Tinner Hill and the adopted daughter of the Reverend Costner, was the first high school student. And Olga has put out her yearbook You can see this brave young woman when she started in high school here. The only other black faces she would have seen at her school were the cafeteria workers, maintenance workers, and in the junior show, the student performance that year, a student performed in blackface. So, what were the policies and practices of the public library in this very segregated community? There were no records, as I said, forbidding access, but it was eminently likely blacks never entered the library. Chris found records from the Fairfax County period that clearly indicate no black patrons were served. Perhaps the most succinct comment on this, I had a conversation with a woman who actually worked at the public library here in Falls Church in 1950-51 when she was a teenager. And she gave a very candid response to my question if black people had been served in the library. She said, "Oh no black people would have ever gone into the library. It was that segregated. That was the reality." So when I went through the library records to try and find evidence of when this might have changed, what I saw first was evidence of an aspiration toward integration, and then finally in 1955, evidence of real clear change brought about through the efforts of the activists Reverend Costner and Dr. Henderson. In 1950, the library hosted an author's night, and one of the local authors represented was Dr. Henderson, who had written a book on black athletes. In 1949, the library put out a pamphlet that advertised anyone 6 and over could get a library card. And this seems to have been sincere. This did not seem to be a wink, wink, only white people six and over. And evidence for that is that in 1953, during a board meeting discussion, one person declared that, the library, quote, operates on a non-segregated basis, close quote. And this was seen as a positive feature of the library and one that they should promote. The language is a little bit oblique, but the intention was there. Finally, in 1955, we get much less oblique. This is when Costner and Henderson approached the library to challenge the library, to inspire the library to open access to black students, their families, and their teachers, and to live up to the promise of the library, the language of the library, that they were open for all. We know this issue is on the mind of Dr. Henderson. I found a Washington Post article from this same month in 1955 where he gave an address to the Black PTA. He at this time, I think, was chair of the Virginia NAACP, and he talked about urging people, it's our duty now to force public libraries to throw open their doors to black students as a way of helping bridge the education gap. So Henderson and Costner met with the librarian to, ask, request, demand access for the black population, and the library voted unanimously to offer this. In 1956, the chairman of the library board, at a speech to a citywide audience, talked about it being basic with us that the library is your library. It belongs to you, all of you, regardless of class or creed or color. This was 1956, and those were strong words in a state like Virginia that was still enmeshed in an official policy of massive resistance to integration, where some schools were choosing to close completely rather than integrate. Then in 1958, the library finally had its first permanent home when this building we're all in right now was constructed. E.B. Henderson and Mary Ellen Henderson were among the guests at the grand opening. Their signatures you'll be able to see over in the guest book in one of the first pages. And planted out front of the new library building was a holly tree that Dr. Henderson had given to the city for the library that he had removed from property of Frederick Foote's that he had inherited. So there was this very nice symbol of the relationship with Henderson and the library. The library had really nice neighbors when it moved to this location. Reverend Costner lived across the street on Virginia Ave. Louise Henderson, Dr. Henderson's mother, lived next door. And there's a picture showing the Hendersons in front of her house with the library construction in the background. And I should note that, that neighborliness would not have been possible had that 1915 zoning ordinance been enacted. So to conclude, I thought it would be useful for the purposes of this conversation specifically to look at this sort of as a case study and look at the factors that contributed to this successful positive change. First, fundamental, the role of activists. And I think, as Jenny said, it's really important that we uncover their work, we recognize it, we pay honor to it, we express gratitude to it for their efforts in helping the library be more of what it should be and claim to be. I think it was also successful in part because of the relationships. Reverend Costner served on a committee with the librarian. E.B. Henderson was quoted as saying he was always a friend to the librarian here in Falls Church. They were literal neighbors. So important for a public library to forge and foster healthy relationships with individuals and organizations outside of the library. And finally, I think it's nice to acknowledge that at crucial moments, the library said yes. The vote to explicitly proffer access to Black students and their families, it was unanimous. It came late, but it was resounding when it came. And it was followed by commitment. The library director in the 60s laid out specific detailed plans for reaching what he called the submerged and anonymous populations of the city. So I guess the third point is just, important for the library to continue to cultivate an affirmative stance, right? To try to say yes when possible to the always ongoing process of making change and making progress and expanding access. And to conclude, maybe I'll just say that I think Jenny does a really superb job of encouraging staff and empowering all of us on staff to do just that, to say yes whenever we can to a patron. Instead of no, we don't have that resource, it's yes, we can find it at the Fairfax system or Arlington, or maybe we can order it, but we do try to say yes. Thank you. And I'll pass off now to...
Good evening. I am not a Falls Church, Arlington native. I am from Loudoun County, on the border of Loudoun County and Fauquier County. Our library system, as explained, Purcellville, that was the closest for us to go to. In Loudoun County, the problem was they could integrate all they wanted to, but most people of color, Black and Afro-Americans, worked on farms, so you were 15, 16 miles away to get to a library. So integrating it, they knew they still didn't have to worry about us coming in. Our parents worked all day long and tried to get off from work and then leave home to drive 16 miles for us to get a book. It was impossible. We were born in that age of Encyclopedia Britannica. I don't even know if they still make them or not, but that was our library. That's how we got our information, because there was nothing near. Middleburg didn't have anything, and if they did have something, we were not going in those places. They may have said we were welcome, but you didn't feel welcome when you went inside, so you didn't stay very long if you went inside those. If you lived in Fauquier County, the nearest place would have been Warrenton, and you definitely weren't welcome in Warrenton. So we grew up in a system that even though we may have been able to get in, we still weren't welcome. I graduated from high school in '73, Loudoun Valley High School in Purcellville, and it was so bad that our tennis team and our golf teams couldn't play golf because the only golf course was in Purcellville, and it was segregated. They refused to let the high school teams play, and if they had a Black on, they couldn't play games there. So that's how Purcellville was, and Middleburg was even worse. Middleburg was just as bad up until probably about 5 years ago. They fought to keep the owner of B&T from building homes up there because they didn't want the community to change. So we are in the 21st century and we are still dealing with issues of race. And sometimes they can hide it by where people live and how people operate. In the city, like where we are here in Falls Church, it can't be it's not as blatant because they have to be obvious and they have to be open. But when you are in a rural area, things are not the same as they are in a city. We dealt with things and we practiced and we worked. Banneker Elementary School just celebrated 75 years of being in existence. That was my elementary school. We dealt with secondhand books, the books that Millersburg Elementary School was finished with, or Emory in Purcellville. We got those books. We never got brand new books. So everything we had, even in our libraries, were secondhand, hand-me-down. And if a page was missing, we missed the information. It's how we were educated and how we came up through the system. But in spite of all that, we still persevered and moved on in our education and learning. So all I would say is, as long as our libraries are open to anyone and our people are willing to study and improve themselves, no matter what doors are locked in your face or closed in your face, you still have the opportunity to better yourself without the help of others trying to hold you back. So that's what my part in teaching young people is: stop worrying about what you don't have or what someone is not giving you. Do what you know is best, and you can learn and move on your own. Ed and all of the panelists here, and I deal with Ed a lot, his parents worked hard to get to where they were in order for Ed to be where Ed is. And Ed didn't just sit around and say, well, Dad, I can't do it, because his dad wasn't going to let him be like that. So we just have to understand that no matter what is in front of us, don't let that be a hindrance to us in our growth and our education and our knowledge of what it is that God is placing on us. So for me, that's all I have. I'm not part of here, so I don't know how y'all's system work. I just know what we had to struggle through just to get a book. Not worrying about if a library will let us in, but where could we get a good book to read? So no matter where you are in life, no matter where people place you, and no matter what people do to you, it's still up to you how you improve your life yourself, not everyone else. Thank you.
Well, isn't it a wonderful world we live in? Now we have internet. We don't really need to get secondhand books. And I'd really like to congratulate Chris on a fabulous book that he's put together, he and Susan Levy at the Fairfax Regional Library. And I was been reading it. He was kind enough to send me a digital copy. And I based a lot of my remarks that I wanted to make today based on what he had written in the book, and what he didn't write in the book as well. But I just wanted to say that, I think that here in the colored schools of Fairfax County, many of the schools had some form of library, and many of the churches had some form of library as well. And like we were saying before, in Washington, D.C., you could use the libraries there. Virginia, as a state, even going back to the 1790 census, or should I say slave census, always had the most enslaved people of any state in the United States. And from that, the other states were populated through, once the cotton gin was invented. And don't be fooled. Eli Whitney was a law student at Harvard who came south to gain money to go to finish his studies at Harvard. So chances are he did not actually invent the cotton gin himself, but the mother of invention, in order to make their work easier for themselves, was probably invented by an enslaved person. And after tobacco was no longer the cash crop, the major cash crop of the United States, Virginia, with its multitude of enslaved, became a slave breeding state, whereas slaves were imported to the southern cotton states where they were sent to pick cotton. Okay? And Alexandria was a major slave trading hub. I have ancestors of mine who were sold down south from Bruin and Hill, Franklin and Armstead, and other slave houses in Alexandria. And a lot of people are confused on how the part of Virginia, which was the District of Columbia, was taken back by Virginia. And that was because in the late 1840s, a guy named Abraham Lincoln, who was in the House of Representatives at the time, proposed a bill in the House of Representatives to free the slaves in the District of Columbia and to compensate the slave owners for their enslaved. Well, it didn't sit very well with the people here in Virginia, so that's the reason why they decided to take back their land here in Northern Virginia. But moving ahead, we talked about briefly about John Reed. My wife and I, we went to Swarthmore College up in Pennsylvania, and we found letters from Emily Howland that had been written back and forth between Emily Howland and John Reed and Betsy Reed about teaching black people to read and write here in Falls Church. And that's the reason why he was kidnapped and taken out to Hunter's Mill and shot in the head, along with another African-American companion of his named Jacob Jackson. At the community center, there is note of another African-American named Frank Brooks, who was, both of these African-American men were gentlemen that were part of the Falls Church Home Guard, which was mostly a Southern Confederate thing where people, as the men went off to fight the war, there was a home guard that was set in place in the communities to look out for the community during time of war. And then when the Emancipation Proclamation did take place and Falls Church became occupied by Union troops, Falls Church, well, the African Americans or the formerly enslaved people were freed because, as it says in the Emancipation Proclamation, all the enslaved people would be set free in states that were currently in rebellion, of which Virginia was a state currently in rebellion. So people like Fred Foote Sr. And many others, I'm kind of biased towards Fred Foote Sr. because he was an ancestor of mine. His sister was my great-great-great-grandmother. His son, Fred Foote Jr., was my ancestor also. And Fred Foote Jr. was one of the early elected officials, African-American elected officials here in Virginia. But I'm going to go talk a little bit about E.B. Henderson, my namesake and my ancestor, who I just finished writing a book about and will be coming out in February, entitled The Grandfather of Black Basketball, The Life and Times of Edwin Bancroft Henderson, because he's credited and is in the Basketball Hall of Fame for introducing the sport to African Americans for the first time on a wide-scale organized basis. When he was born in 1883 in Southwest Washington, D.C., at the home of his grandmother, Eliza Henderson. Eliza Henderson was actually enslaved on the Fitzhugh plantation. That was my great-great-grandmother. And when the will of Mordecai Fitzhugh bequeathed her to his daughter, Juliana Slade, I believe that she was to be breeded, and she became pregnant, and she ran away to be with her mother, Elizabeth Memitofoot, on another plantation. And she was, as the law prescribed in those days, she was to be sold down south, which was the most horrific thing that an African American could ever be threatened with. Well, E.B. was born there in Southwest, and was his mother, Louisa, taught him to read and write at an early age. And because of that, he was always literate and was a very, and became a writer at an early age too. His first publication was a Spalding publication under the auspices of the first African American Athletic League, which he started. And that was in 1910 to 1913. And then in 1939, he wrote the first Negro in Sports. And then this is at the behest of Carter G. Woodson, the father of black history. And so in 1949, when he wrote it again, 10 years later, that's when he was invited here as one of the authors in Falls Church. But one of the things I'd also like to talk about just briefly was we talk about Luther Jackson High School as the first high school other than the monastic school. But you have to understand that in order to get the land to build that school, they actually took the land by eminent domain from a woman named Automarius Enid Stone Faison. At first they made a request to purchase the land. She didn't, at $500 an acre. Well, they had offered everybody else $1,200 an acre. So she didn't reply. It was an insult. And then they decided to condemn her land to take it by eminent domain. So even though it was a great accomplishment having a high school, the way they went about it was very underhanded and dastardly. I'd like to end by saying that Reverend Costner and my grandfather, E.B. Henderson, E.B. Henderson was always associated with the NAACP. Even though Reverend Costner was as well, he was also a member of the Fairfax County Colored Citizens Association. And that's who he represented in the fight to integrate both the schools and the libraries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to pass it down to Devanshi.
Thank you very much. We will have a question and answer period at this point. I can lead us off with maybe our first question, which is, we often view our community, the City of Falls Church, as immune to some of the issues that have plagued other communities. But we've learned today that actually is not the case. And we learned about anti-literacy laws within the Commonwealth, secondhand textbooks being used by some of our friends in other parts of Northern Virginia, including City of Falls Church, and then of course distance barriers to access information and libraries. So why is this conversation still important right now? Why are we having a panel discussion on this? It's open to anybody, but if you have a thought, maybe you can raise your hand. I can pass the mic down. Why is this conversation still relevant today? Chris?
Well, you can't make change without knowing the context from where you've come from. So having an understanding of why things are the way that they are kind of helps build those bridges and understanding and corrections and course corrections for making libraries more equitable and accessible to everyone. Anyone else want to weigh in?
We live in a paradoxical environment today, whereas we want to set the record straight, and we want to be inclusive and diverse. And then on the other hand, we have people talking about critical race theory and wanting to create curriculum that is, eliminates everything that is diverse and inclusive. So go figure. Where will we go from here? It seems like we're always taking 2 steps forwards and 1 step backwards. Hopefully, work like what Chris has done will help us to realize that we haven't always been that shining city on the hill, but we do everything that we have. We have blemishes. We have history that needs to be told, whether good, bad, or indifferent. And I, for one, applaud that.
Also, it's still important to have these conversations, even though we are in the modern age of technology, we still have young people who do not have the assets of internet in their homes. So the library will be the place that they will have to congregate just to get the information that a lot of us just can get sitting at our tables or our desks. So we always have to remember, just because we have accomplished, we have arrived, that there are still those that are still lagging behind us, and we have to make sure that they're included in everything we do, or we will still have the offset of people not getting the education because they don't have the information. And the distance problem will still be the same. If just because I had to drive 16 miles, if you don't have internet in your home and they still have a report to do, the same distance applies because they can't get to the information. So I think that's why the libraries are still a very important topic, that we still have to make sure they are supplied with what they need to be able to handle the upcoming technology and the upcoming people and young people that we are looking to serve.
And I'll just speak loudly for the next question. We'll head right into it. When we have, did you want to? Okay.
I can.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to say that I think it's crucial to have these conversations because it still exists. So it may not be as blatant as a sign on the door that says no Negroes allowed, but there are still barriers to utilizing services. There are still barriers to acquiring knowledge. And for me, the public library was always a magical place, because anybody could go in and it had all these books that you could explore. All of these resources, all of the knowledge was available. And so to think that it wouldn't be available to somebody just based on, they're black, or based on they're unhoused, or they're based on that they have differing abilities, to me, that's just abhorrent. So I think we still have to have those conversations. Race is the one that I think is one of the most blatant, but there are other people who have difficulty accessing the library, and we have to take down those barriers as well so that everybody has equal access. So that's why I think we have to keep having the conversation. And sometimes they're hard conversations. They're not all warm and fuzzy and kittens and butterflies. These are hard conversations to have. To admit that the public library has not always been the place that it espoused to be, that it did put up barriers. It does put up barriers to people in the community.
And so today's youth do often access the internet to be able to find information, and sometimes the information that is on the internet may not entirely be accurate. But we also learned today that sometimes information was shared in our past where it was secondhand information, and that information was also written and provided in a certain way. If you have a generational barrier to access to information, historically accurate information, how does that impact the way that we are able to understand our history, accurately understand our history? And the second part of that question is, how do we ensure that young people are able to accurately understand all parts of our history? It's to all of you, any of you.
Well, I think one part is having the Falls Church History Room. I mean, it's a great resource, and there's a whole table of historical documents that are available, and they're also available online as well. And places, nonprofit agencies in our community like Tinner Hill that also have a lot of documents that are online. But I think also having it available in the library, the type of technology that we have available that people can take advantage of and use.
And in addition to the resources in the Falls Church History Room, which are abundant, and I encourage everyone to go in there when you have time and dig through, we also have materials that are available to circulate. We've set out a small selection here of some of, there are a lot of histories written about this community. And also, we have books like Cast, Isabel Wilkinson, which provides a really, really useful lens for thinking about these issues.
And just recently, the additional funding has been provided to staff the Virginia Room on a regular basis here in the Mary Stiles Library. And I think that is a really added plus to the new facility and what's going on here.
Paula mentioned that there's some resources out here. They're right on the table, and if you would like to touch it, there's some gloves as well. And we can make sure that we can assist you in touching some of these very precious documents. But you'll look and see that one of the entries does talk about censorship of information, right? And in many ways, access is another form of censorship.
Which is another topic that is very much in the news right now in terms of censorship and First Amendment rights and freedom to read and all of that.
Do we have any questions from, I can bring the mic to you. Do you have a question? Yes, I can bring the mic over there. Thank you.
I have to admit, this isn't a question. I just wanted to make a comment about the importance of libraries. I've lived in countries where there were no public libraries, and the libraries that existed were private, and they were in homes of wealthy people. And you had to subscribe, you become a member, And when my family moved overseas, this was Brazil, the thing I missed the most about home was libraries, because this was before having computers and internet and everything. It's like, what am I going to do? How am I going to find out about these birds, these plants, the things I wanted to know? And I felt it was a huge loss. So libraries are hugely important, really. Some people don't have them at all.
Can you just go back to the history of the library? When Mary Riley Stiles was founded, it was a Fairfax County library, or was it a private library? And then it became, can you just do that? Yeah, thanks.
I think that's a really important thing to establish. It was founded in 1899 by the Village Preservation and Improvement Society, which operated it for more or less 10 years, Chris, I think. They started with 500 volumes, but private subscription library. And then the collection seems to have been dormant for a few years, abandoned at the post office, and then 1913, I want to say, what would become the Women's Club in Falls Church rescued the collection. And that's when Mary Riley Stiles, she was the director of the library committee of the Women's Club, and this was her baby. She ran this thing for decades. She was really the heart and soul and animating force that kept the library going. Her daughter, Elizabeth Morgan Stiles, in a speech given when the library was renamed in 1977. Before that, it was the Falls Church Public Library. In 1977, it became the Mary Riley Stiles Public Library. Elizabeth, her daughter, said, when the library always came first with Mom. You know, when Mom wanted to do the library, we knew that there wouldn't be dinner that night, or dinner would be late. You know, she really was the force behind this. But still then, it was, you know, a women's club organization. There were fees. The women contributed the books. They staffed the library during the opening hours. There are great stories. There are lots of different accounts in the history room of the early days of the library. And the women who worked it would bring their own wood to burn to stay warm because they didn't want to spend library funds on that. They wanted library funds to go toward buying more books. It was 1928, I think, that the library got its first big $300 from the town to help support the library. 1939, I think, is when the affiliation with Fairfax County started. So there we have free public library from that point. Still known as the Falls Church Public Library until 1977. You might have things to add.
That was perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, exactly. And there was this really crucial moment where the Women's Committee very wisely, I think, said, okay, this has gotten big, this has gotten beyond us, and they gave the library to the city. And the records are a little bit murky, so that in, I think, the 50s, at a couple different times, the city felt a need to go back and issue proclamations saying, you know, that yes, they legislated, they approved the creation of this public library. And in the 39 period and through the 40s, they created a board. You know, they formalized the procedures that had previously been somewhat casual when it was just run by the women's organization. The library, when it was renamed, the library board at the time intended it to be called the Elizabeth Morgan Stiles Library because Mary Riley Stiles' daughter Elizabeth was also such a force in the library, volunteering her time and serving on the board. But Elizabeth said, oh, no, if you're going to name it for anyone, you must name it for Mother. And it was Elizabeth and her brother Francis who, after the death of their mother in 1946, bequeathed land, you know, made the land available to the city of Falls Church for, finally, the library to have a dedicated building on this lot. Before that, the library moved, I don't know how many times, 10, 12 times. The one library director in an oral history tape said, oh, the poor books, you know, they had to be moved so many times. And reading that, I thought, oh, the poor librarians.
I was going to say, we're not moving again. Not anytime soon.
So you mentioned a couple times what Dr. Henderson and Reverend Costner did. What did they do? Did they write a letter? Did they protest?
Yeah, they met with the librarian. They made a formal request for access. We saw Henderson talking about the importance of this. And this was after the two Brown v. Board of Education rulings in 1954 and 55 that overturned the Plessy. You know, the Supreme Court finally recognized that separate is inherently unequal and said, no, you know, everything has to be open for all. And E.B. Henderson has a supremely eloquent letter to the editor of the Washington Post. How many letters and op-ed pieces did he write? Over 3,000. Talk in the immediate wake of the first Brown ruling, saying, "Okay, you know, this whole structure will collapse now, and things will finally open." But they asked to meet with the librarian. The librarian sat down with them, and they wanted the same service for the black students, the black children of Falls Church. They wanted the same access that the white students had, which was to come to the library. get them library cards, give them a tour, show them how it worked, make sure they were welcomed, that they knew not just that, okay, they officially could cross the threshold, but they would have a card. They would know how to use it and how to find the resources they want. So they had conversations with the librarian. There's correspondence. Dr. Henderson presented the history room with some materials. We have a letter of thanks that the library wrote to him. And then they came back and they said, okay, great, but our black kids are still going to school outside of Falls Church. Let's let their teachers, please, have access to the library so they can come and get materials as the teachers of the Falls Church city schools could do. So, and that measure also was passed, that yes, and there's a letter from the librarian of the time to the Reverend Costner, including the full text of the resolution that the board made granting access.
There's a difference between officially being integrated and then being welcomed in the library. It's not the same thing necessarily. And in some places, I don't know if anyone has seen the movie Hidden Figures, whereas there was one of the women who was wanted to learn computing language. And that book wasn't available in the section that was available to African Americans. So I don't know if that was the case here. I don't have any evidence that it was. But those are sometimes what happened in places where, in Virginia, where African Americans had access to the library, but it was limited access.
I guess I have a broader question about more of like these resources and collections, and like obviously we've told history in different ways throughout history, and we're kind of telling it a different way than has traditionally been done in the US now. So I don't know if anyone can speak to what it's been like to see how we tell US history change over time and how we know that we're telling it as we should be now. I think some things are obvious. We can know that like racism, slavery, xenophobia, things like that are wrong at any time, even when it's the mainstream thing. But how does that become mass cultural understanding? And I don't know, have you seen changes in the way resources are presented and written in your time that you've researched and lived and read?
To that point, a lot of library histories have been written just from my research. There was a Falls Church history that was written about the library. There was a Fairfax County Public Library history that was written when it was like the 50th anniversary of the county library system. No mention about anything about the library being segregated, about black citizens being able to access it. And it quickly became apparent when Suzanne and I were first given this research topic that nobody had ever written about this. Everybody thinks about, the restaurants, particularly the school system, like they were segregated, and that history has been pretty well told and still things worth telling. But the library is like just so shocking. Like everyone should be able to access a book, and why has nobody ever really looked into this? So it quickly became a labor of love, trying to go as deep as possible to find why was this the case, when these particular libraries were desegregated, who were the civil rights activists that were responsible for desegregating. Reverend Costner, I had never heard of Reverend Costner until I started researching this, and he's just a fascinating guy. I mean, he should have his own historical marker, because he did so much, not just for the library, but for going to the school board for over a decade, just begging for the improved one-room Falls Church school. The colored school was just dilapidated, and he kept going asking for improvements, and the school board just kept tabling the topic and ignoring it. And for over a decade, he kept going to bat, asking for a high school, an integrated high school to come, and he just kept getting ignored. So I think a lot of this, the shift that I've noticed is also with the library's policies as well. Everybody, I think, had a reckoning moment in I guess it was 2020 when George Floyd was murdered, and that conversation of just looking at race and how history has been written, and that's kind of when our project started was, well, what is this story? Nobody's really talked about it. And so we delved into it, and that's just kind of an example of the answer to that question.
There's an old African proverb that says, when the lion speaks, the whole truth will be known. Usually we will see the history spoken from the victors or those who are in control. Okay, but we're finding out that history is much more nuanced than that. And a lot of times we're right in this day and age, we're wanting to hear from the indigenous people. We're wanting to hear from those who have not had a voice before. And for that reason, it's very important for a people to tell their own story. That's why there is a museum of the American Indian. That's why there is a National Museum of African American History and Culture. And you know, some of it I think may go even a little bit overboard, like when we renamed our schools here in Falls Church and we got rid of Thomas Edison. He's a founding father. I mean, he did a lot of good things too. Slavery was a reality, okay? Am I ashamed that my people were enslaved? No, I embrace that. I like being able to know the facts about my people's history. And I think that hopefully as we go forward, we won't be embarrassed about our history. We'll have to reconcile this history before we can move forward in some kind of a constructive environment. And for that reason, I'm hoping that truth be told, and we'll get to the truth at some point now in our near existence.
I was just going to say, so I think it's also a question of representation. So what we've seen more recently, and I think it certainly occurred with the murder of George Floyd, was an increase in, I think, own voices or the people who it's happening to being published. So the numbers of books being published has increased. I'm a former children's librarian, and so looking at what, in terms of picture books, what is being published, that has increased, but is still not at the levels that it needs to be. I mean, it's still pretty shocking. I think picture books about animals are more prevalent than picture books about Black children still. I don't think it has reached, or children of color. It still hasn't reached the level that it should be and needs to be. There's a graphic out there. I think it's, oh gosh, where is it? In Wisconsin, the children's, I don't remember. But there's a graphic out there that shows like the percentage of children's books and how many are, you know, what depict white kids, how many depict animals, how many depict people of color. And it's pretty shocking, but I think has changed in recent years. So I think having the representation in the library, and that we have library books for everybody and everybody can have access. And that parents get to choose what they want their children to have. But we have everything for everybody.
I have a question about one of the observations, comments that the library director made, Miss Carroll. You spoke about the barriers that exist today, and you emphasized the word barriers several times. So I'm very curious, as a former educator, what are some of the key barriers today to accessing information, resources available at public libraries? And what are public libraries doing today and communities doing today to overcome these barriers or obstacles? Thank you.
So I think one that's happened very recently is overdue fines, which were a huge barrier. They did research around that it actually didn't encourage people to bring books back to the library. In fact, it was a barrier. So either people didn't have the funds to pay down their fines, or they were embarrassed or ashamed to come back to the library. So it was a huge barrier. So a lot of public libraries across the United States and in Virginia especially have been changing that. So we changed that in July 1st of COVID year. What is that, 2020? So we no longer have overdue fines. I think some of the other barriers still exist in terms of where the libraries are located. So location, I think oftentimes technology, the lack of technology can be a barrier. Funding, resources can be a barrier. Here in this community, the things that we've done are the overdue fines. We also, the first 10 copies are free if somebody wants to make a copy, and then it's the honor system. If you want to pay for copies, because that can sometimes be a barrier if somebody wants to come in and print off their resume, or they need to print off forms that they have to take somewhere. I do think distance is a barrier. When I was working as the youth services supervisor, what I discovered was that the library isn't accessible to all because of its location. So if you lived on the far end of town, say over by the Taco Bell where the fields are, the comments that I would hear from parents is that it is far to come to the library. And I thought, it's not that far. Like, you can hop in your car and it's like, 5 minutes. And I didn't realize that a lot of the families that may live in those areas don't have cars, or their only car is being used by the person who is working. So if you're a mother who has 2 little kids and one goes in a stroller and the other one you have to take by the hand, walking a mile to the library is prohibitive. It is a barrier. So trying to think about how to reach out to those communities that may be a little bit farther, don't have as many resources, but are still in the city. They're still here in the city. And they may not be as big of a population, but we still need to serve them. So that's part of our strategic plan, is outreach, is to continue what we are doing here at the library, to continue that outreach. And I think, as I said in my introductory comments, that the community survey did show, while it wasn't huge percentages, we had overall 90% approval rating, which is great. However, and I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of my staff because they are the ones who make it that 90%. I always look at.
May I have your attention, please? The library will close in 5 minutes. Please gather your materials and make your way to.
It's not for us. We can stay.
The closing time is not a barrier to this conversation.
No, it's not. So looking at, who was saying that they were unsatisfied with library services, and I mentioned that it was low income, low educational levels, the Black community were the ones that stood out for me. So it was clear to me that we still have work to do to reach people. So I hope that answered your question.
And I will say the next part of our discussion will include a facilitated conversation to help us better understand what some of these barriers continue to be.
Thank you. It's kind of like a follow-up question. So many of our libraries still lack services and collection materials for people with disabilities, as well as non-native English speakers. Additionally, there is also a large portion of Black and Hispanic adults who have never visited a public library compared to their white counterparts. So what are some things that we can do in order to increase access and services in that area?
So in terms of accessibility, so with the renovation of the library, we did increase our accessibility for people with differing abilities. So prior to the renovation, our stacks were not wide enough for people with wheelchairs or walkers or things like that. They were also very, very tall. So that changed. All of the aisles, the whole building is now ADA compliant. So the bathrooms, the number of bathrooms that we have, the stacks so that people can get in. And we're also continuing to assess that piece in terms of accessibility for people with differing abilities. So visual abilities, hearing abilities. Both of our conference rooms have systems in them for people with hearing disabilities. And then the other part of your question was the non-native English speakers. So I think it's that balance for us too, is that all of these services take people. So it's people to have the library open, but people also to provide the programs and services that the community wants. So we do currently have an ESOL class that is meeting online on Mondays. And then we do have a Spanish language collection. So for us, other library systems, and Chris could probably talk more, Fairfax County has multiple languages available. And then looking at our materials, brochures and applications have been in Spanish. We have a language line that can do any language translation. So I just lost my train of thought. The outreach to communities who aren't coming in. So that's one thing I think we need to continue to work on. I saw when I started doing, I would go to the ESOL homework club, English as a second language homework club for the kids. I speak Spanish, so I would talk to the parents while the kids were having, tutoring. And that's where I learned a lot of the things that I learned about that community, especially that they, found the distance to be a barrier, that they didn't know the library was here, that they didn't know that they could just take out books, that they didn't have to pay for the books to take out the books. So, education and breaking down those barriers, because as I think you mentioned, in a lot of other countries, the libraries, you have to pay for them. And so if you don't have the means to pay to get into a library, you're not going to get those resources. So I think education is a portion of it, and outreach.
I have a question about bookmobile. That seems like that was something that some libraries had for a while and it sort of disappeared. Was that found not to be a very helpful outreach?
No, I think libraries are still doing bookmobiles and in vehicles, gasoline-powered vehicles, but also bike vehicles, bike mobiles. We do not have a bookmobile. We have on occasion borrowed a vehicle from the police department, thank you, Chief Gavin, and gone and done outreach with the police vehicle. So, and Carrie, did you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention library to your door because
library to your door.
I've used that periodically, particularly during the COVID time. and I still use it sometimes, even though I'm able to come to the library directly. And the librarians come and they deliver my what I've checked out, and they take back my what I've borrowed. So it's really a nice service. And there are some people who physically can't get to the library, and so that because of a physical disability or an illness or something, and that's why that program exists. Yep.
I don't know that I need a mic. Hi, I'm Molly with CIFA. I also, thank you. When I'm not working with, is it on? That's okay. I don't sound that. Do I sound that loud? I'm a criminal defense attorney in the other part of my life, and I've represented many folks who were incarcerated as juveniles. Most of these clients were people of color, and who are now who grew up in the penitentiary system, and are now out and can't read. And I have been banging my head against the wall, trying to find resources for these folks. They can't get driver's license, they can't get jobs, they're too embarrassed to tell people. I've had some clients, I'm the first person that they've ever told that they can't read, and I've looked everywhere. And is that something that the library offer? I know we offer English as a second language, but I've yet to been able to find any programs for my clients that are meaningful programs. There's been some online stuff, but it wasn't really, meaningful.
Probably at little to no cost.
Correct. Little to no cost.
That would be so there's Northern Virginia Literacy Council.
Yeah, I know.
Who does provide. We don't have anything here at the moment. However, I don't see why we couldn't do something. Yeah.
I'll always say yes. She does. But I think that's a really important example of, a library doesn't always know what it doesn't know, right? So I think conversations, events like this are just critical. Any kind of outreach opportunity, Jenny, you talked about when you were at the other location, meeting there for story time. That's when you find out what we don't know and where the improvements need to come. It's an iterative process. It's an ever ongoing, always changing process to try to continuously expand access.
The bookmobile question. Fairfax County had a bookmobile from 1939 until like late 80s, and they converted it to access services, which sounds like it's like the book to your door. Is that? Yeah. And it's the same program where anybody who needs a book, or they're at home, or they have special needs, they bring the book to your house, and it's a fantastic resource that's available. Other things, outreach examples that we do. Every student who's enrolled in Fairfax County Public Schools, they have the opportunity to get a Fairfax County library card. I'm not involved with it because I'm local history and genealogy, but I think some of the librarians go out there and they automatically just get signed up for a library card when they get the application. Another thing that we do is we go to farmers markets, we go to fairs, different celebrations that are in the community. We have outreach tables there, and we bring a computer and sign up for a library card, and we tell you all about our services. One thing that our library director, Jessica Hudson, has talked about in the past is hoping to bring back the bookmobile to serve some of those underserved communities. It hasn't become a reality yet, but I know that's something that is kind of been discussed, and it's kind of in the background there.
Any other questions? Well, maybe you can join me in giving a round of applause to our wonderful panel here for the great conversation. Thank you so much.